Okay. Our next presentation is with Jim Mullan. Jim, what's your exact title?
I'm the Regional Wildlife Manager for Maryland Department of Natural Resources, Wildlife and Heritage Division.
He's located in Cumberland. And have those of you, did you get a notice about the webinars that we've had, the wildlife webinars? Yeah. We've had a wildlife webinar the last 3 months, I believe. And they're on our website. Jim did one on basically what you're seeing here. Was one on turkeys, turkey management. Jim McCann, who will be here later, did one on conservation and biodiversity and wildlife. And we're going to have another one coming up next Thursday on young forests by Tom Matthews, who is actually going to be here as well. And then in June, or the first Thursday in June, we'll have one on deer management. So,
added to the Woodland Stewards email list, and I think they get.
Yeah, you'll get notifications of all these. So, Jim?
Do they have them recorded so you can listen to them multiple times?
Yeah.
Because it's during my workday, I can't.
No, they're 12 o'clock on Thursdays, but yeah, they're recorded on the website. You can go to it anytime. You don't need any special software. You just click on it and it plays. It's Adobe Connect is the technology we use.
If you have difficulty sleeping, watch mine several times.
Oh,
and
is
that our
like this?
Ah, that'll help. There we go.
I didn't put the thing back in.
Technical difficulties.
Should work now.
Let's give it a try. All right, cool. All right, let's go back to our title. Again, my name's Jim. I work for Maryland DNR. I've been a wildlife manager for almost 30 years now. I'm also an adjunct professor currently at Garrett College teaching wildlife management and biology. So I know a little bit about this stuff, but certainly if you have any questions, ask me and I'll do my best to answer them. How many people are from Maryland in here? Okay, majority of the class, cool. You're from Maryland, you've heard the saying before that Maryland's America in miniature. And that's based on the fact that we have so many different types of landscapes here in Maryland, from the plateau of Garrett County, the Ridge and Valley, the Blue Ridge, the Piedmont, to the coastal bays on the eastern shore. We have really diverse habitats here within this state. Because of those diverse habitats, we have really diverse populations and speciation of wildlife. For instance, get my laser working, 97 mammals, 410 species of birds, almost 50 species of reptiles, and 42 species of amphibians. In addition to that, 635 fishes, an estimated 20,000 invertebrates, and approximately 3,000 vascular plants. So again, we have a big, diverse ecosystem out there in our state, even though our state's relatively small. And in Maryland, by regulation, wildlife is birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians, so that's my area of expertise. So what we're going to talk about today is some of the principles of wildlife ecology and management. We'll talk about different examples of wildlife habitats, talk about some management practices and the benefits and impacts that they can have upon wildlife. If you were taking this class, these classes, this would be 2 semesters worth and 6 credits. So we got a lot to cover here in a short time. So it's geared towards if you're managing your own property, and some questions you need to ask yourself before you get started. What's the most important aspect of managing this property for you or for me? For a lot of people, it's recreation, whether they hunt, they fish, they like to bird watch, whatever. For some folks, income is important, whether you bought the property to be a primary source of income or to supplement, maybe help pay your taxes. Are aesthetics important to you? Or do you just want to be part of the conservation movement and do your part? All those things are valuable goals. It just depends upon what you're interested in. The big question is, can you accomplish something meaningful on that property? Okay, step 1, after you determine kind of what your personal goals are, you want to do an inventory of the natural features of your property. What type of habitat do you have? Our focus is primarily on forests here today. And in terms of forest, is it hardwood forest? Is it a conifer forest? How big is it? How old is it? How does it fit into the bigger landscape picture? And there's a really cool tool available to you now on the internet called Google Earth. If you haven't used that, jump on there and take a look, because you can start at the global level, zoom down to your backyard. Gives you a really neat perspective of how your property fits into everything else. If you already have a forest management plan done or a stewardship plan, a lot of this has already been done for you, and you have that information at hand. You want to look at other things like if you have any wetlands on the property, and what type of wetlands are they, permanent or are they seasonal, because there's an important differentiation between those that we'll talk about. Have field areas, open landscapes. Those can be very important for wildlife habitat. Other things such as rivers, spring seeps, rock outcroppings, sandy ridges, those are all kind of unique habitat features. Okay, after you've inventoried your habitat, the next thing you want to do is kind of inventory the wildlife that you have around. And it's kind of cool to make a list of animals that you're aware are on your property or you've seen around. If you absolutely don't have a clue, some things you can do are pick up field guides. And there's field guides available for about every critter, every track, every bird's nest, every type of dropping. You can figure out yourself, what kind of animals. You can also find species lists. For instance, if you go to our DNR website, we actually have lists of all the different birds, mammals, reptiles, amphibians that are commonly found. Am I in your way? I'm sorry.
Just one.
Sorry about that. So again, you want to try to figure out what's on your property, what's on the adjacent property, because you want to be looking at a much larger perspective than just your back 40, if you will. Okay. Need to consider some other things. If you have invasive species, and we'll talk more in depth about them, and when we go out in the field, we'll actually point out some invasive species to you. You're probably going to have to control those things. If you're going to do any extensive work, are there any regulations, laws, permits required that may impact what you want to do? You need to look into that. Kind of develop a timeline. And again, if you work with a professional forester, a professional wildlife manager, they're going to help walk you through all these different steps. Okay, some of the basic principles we need to talk about are size requirements for different species. For instance, grassland birds, a lot of the common sparrows, need fairly large blocks of grassland habitat, anywhere from, say, 10 acres up to thousands of acres. Okay, but if you have smaller properties and you can connect those up, those smaller properties can, provide that larger habitat component. Interior bird species, for instance, or something else we'll talk about. In some cases, they need tens of thousands of acres of blocks of forest land. Some other species, such as woodland edge, or sometimes referred to as early successional stage species, can generally survive in smaller, more diverse blocks. And those are generally the more common species we're familiar with. You may see those in and around your backyard. Okay, another group of animals, migratory birds, and most of the passerines or songbirds we're familiar with are migratory. They may, for instance, have their breeding range up here in the northern part of the United States. Their wintering range may be down here in Mexico, South America, Costa Rica, but as they're making that migration, they may use some of those habitats in between as stopover areas. So a lot of the migratory birds we have stop over, spend a little bit of time, for instance, here in Maryland, and just about any kind of habitat can be used, as long as it's suitable for that particular species as migratory habitat. Another principle to talk about, different animals have different sized home range, different abundances or populations. Pick something like a chipmunk here. A chipmunk only has a home range of about 1/2 square mile. They don't need a lot of extensive territory. Because of that, you might have 2 to 4 chipmunks per acre. But if we look at something like a black bear, and we say a male black bear has a home range of about 60 to 100 square miles, and they're very territorial, you may only have 70 black bears within that 100 square mile area. So again, it depends upon the size of the animal, their habitat requirements, We need to just be cognizant of those different factors. When we talk about wildlife habitat, there's 4 basic components. It's food, it's cover, it's water, and they all have to be suitably arranged so the animal can have access to all those at any given time. This is the basis of habitat management, and I bet any 4th grade student can name those 4 things pretty quickly. We always want to make sure we're providing for those 4 things: food, cover, water, suitably arranged in space. Okay, there's different strategies to how you manage your habitat. If you already have excellent quality habitat, protecting it, maintaining it, keeping it where it is probably your best strategy. If you have habitat that's subpar or marginal, you can do certain things to enhance it to make it a little bit better. If you have poor quality habitat, you probably want to do alteration. You want to change some things around, take out those poor aspects, provide for better aspects. If the habitat's been destroyed, you're going to try to restore it. If you're starting from scratch, say in a brownfield setting, or it was a mowed yard and now you want to start over and provide better quality habitat, you can actually create wildlife habitat. We'll talk about a few ways to do that. Say, habitat requirements, what we're leading to, are different for critters like a black bear, a bobwhite quail, a wood frog. Okay, black bear they're pretty much a forest-dependent species. They need a large block of forest with some openings, some wetlands, things like that. Bobwhite quail require a different type of habitat. They like earlier successional stage habitats. For instance, croplands, grasslands, some brush, a little bit of woodlands. That's ideal quail habitat. When we talk about the wood frog, their habitat needs are slightly different. For instance, they need these vernal pools or temporary seasonal ponds for their breeding habitat because they lay their eggs in the water, but yet they spend most of their time in forested habitats, usually forested habitats without a lot of disturbance. So again, depending upon the species you're talking about, habitat requirements can be different. So let's talk about some habitat elements. And when we do that, and we talk about habitat, we said food, water, cover, suitably arranged. What we're usually looking at when we survey that habitat is what is the limiting factor, or which habitat element is in the least supply, because that's the one we need to make improvements to. So you go and you'd inventory, you'd look and see what kind of cover do I have available for wildlife. And when we talk about cover, there's usually 2 aspects. There's winter or weather cover, to escape, really nasty weather. There's also escape cover. That's to get away from predators. So you have to be thinking about both those. So things like caves and ledges may be a cover. Cavities, some animals are cavity nesters, treetops, dense vegetation, brush piles, we'll talk about them later. Those are all different types of cover or shelter, some people refer to. Food, okay? Food can be hard or soft mast, and we use the term mast basically to refer to nuts or soft fruits. Acorns would be an example of a hard mast when we talk about forest-dependent wildlife. Okay, things like wolf trees, I'll show you an example of one of these later, but wolf trees are really large, older trees that have grown in open sunlight. Usually provide good shelter, good food source for wildlife. You can also plant food plots. If you watch any of the hunting or outdoor channels, you're going to get barraged with all these different commercials for why you need to buy this clover mix or this food plot mix. Food plots are generally supplemental foods for wildlife. Usually the animals aren't dependent upon them, but you can actually enhance their nutrition through planting them. Water is required for all living things. We can go a long time without food, but we can't go very long with water. Wildlife is the same way. They can get their water from a variety of sources: wetlands, riparian zones, spring seeps, temporary wetlands. We'll talk about some of those examples. Finally, space. All 3 of these elements need to be arranged in the space within that animal's home range. That's why home range is important. Something else, habitat changes with the season. For instance, we're coming into a time right now where our forests the leaves are coming back on the trees, herbaceous stuff's growing up, all the forbs. You got all this lush vegetation. That landscape changes dramatically come wintertime. And that forest, all that cover, all that food suddenly may become a limiting factor. Similarly, even these lush green fields, would provide great escape cover for things like a meadow vole or a cottontail rabbit. Come wintertime, they've either been harvested or the grasses and forbs have died off. Suddenly that cover is not available. So you need to be thinking about that as well. So, we mentioned mast trees. They're very important. Most of the forest-dependent wildlife that we have here in Appalachian have evolved over millions of years to survive off of hard mast, off of acorns, hickories, nuts, as well as soft mast such as cherries, raspberries, things like that. Okay? Rocks or cliffs or outcroppings or big rock piles, again, they're a form of cover or shelter. Snags are dead standing trees, and a lot of wildlife utilize those, either as perches or cavities, or some animals actually get their food, like woodpeckers, out of the insects that live in these things. Questions, anything? Water, we talked about all those sources, and wolf trees. Some other really important things I mentioned earlier, vernal pools. Vernal pools are temporarily ponded water. And why they're so important? Because they're temporary in nature. They don't have fish that live in there. Since fish don't live in there, they're important breeding areas for things like frogs and salamanders. They can lay their eggs in there, the larvae develop, they're not being fed on by the fish. So that's why they're so important. Another term, coarse woody debris. Basically, coarse woody debris is dead and down bogs that eventually are being decomposed. They're great habitat for earthworms, insects, as well as our amphibian friends. Snags. This is an example. A snag is a dead standing tree, and you're all familiar with examples of those. Rock outcrops, cliffs. This is an example of a talus slope. Okay, we call them boulder gardens. But they're great habitat for some of our rare and endangered species. For instance, the eastern wood rat. You may not know that there is a native rat here to the Appalachian Mountains. It's not related in any way to the Norway or black rat. It actually looks more like a squirrel and has a fuzzy tail, but wood rats were probably fairly common in Maryland at one time. Right now they're considered a threatened species because their habitat is so limited. But they live in places like this. Similarly, our timber rattlesnake, and whether you like snakes or not, I find people usually love them or hate them. Timber rattlesnakes are also threatened here in Maryland now, and this is the type of habitat that you're going to encounter or find snakes. So if you have this type of habitat on your property, it's really important to protect. Some other types of rare habitats, shale barrens. Shale barrens are found primarily in western Allegheny County, eastern Washington County. Typically, they're remnants of the old prairie that we used to have here in Maryland. Tend to be very dry, hot landscapes, and you'll find some unusual critters like fence lizards living on these things. Similarly, if you have a fen or a wet sedge meadow, and you're going to find these more Carroll County, Baltimore County, these are kind of rare habitats because of the bog turtles that live in there. And again, they're a protected species. So if you have anything like this, certainly you want to protect it.
What kind of turtle was that?
Bog turtle. And if you think you might have those, contact us, because our threatened and endangered species folks would be very interested coming out, looking at it, and giving you some recommendations on it.
They have that definite ring on their neck.
Yes. Yep. Very pronounced yellow ring when they're adults. So what are you going to manage your property for? It's a good question, and most people really don't know where to start. The current philosophy in wildlife management is to manage with an eye on quality habitats, not focusing on any one particular species. You provide quality habitat, you're going to have a diversity of wildlife species there. Some of the guiding principles we recommend you follow: regional priorities. In certain regions of the country, Some animals need special attention or need additional management. We'll talk about a few of those. Certainly, if you have species of greatest concern, rare, threatened, and endangered, you want to be sensitive to those. Any rare species or special habitats, we just looked at a few of those examples. And definitely, whatever your objectives are. You know, you may have some ideas for the property, and it's your property. So it's important that whatever plan is written, it meets your goals. So let's talk about some of these regional objectives. And many of you may have heard about forest interior dwelling birds. The acronym we all throw around is called FIDS. FIDS is a group of about 25 different passerine or songbird species, dependent upon fairly large blocks of woods, generally mid-stage to older woods, as Jonathan was talking about. And 50-acre tracts, as an example, don't like a lot of edge. Have you talked about edge yet? If not, we'll talk about it. Interspersion of different habitat types. They're considered kind of an umbrella species for a lot of different forest dependent wildlife and forest processes. So FIDS are something to give consideration to. For instance, if we're talking about an area of Prince George's County that there's the last remaining, say, 50-acre block of forest for 20 miles in each direction, that's probably, a pretty critical area that you want to keep that forest for forest interior dwelling bird species. So again, this gives you a good example of what FIDS habitat is. A lot of canopy closure, very large contiguous forest, and a lot of vertical structure. Now, I will point out that sometimes folks will confuse FIDS habitat and think that all FIDS habitat has to be old-growth forest, and that's not the case. There are some forest interior dwelling birds that actually require younger or earlier successional forest, and that's why it's important to have this diverse structure of, of all different types of canopy. Okay, another regional priority are things like Delmarvas and vernal pools. If you're from the eastern shore of Maryland, you may be familiar with what's called a Delmarva Bay. Delmarva bays are seasonally flooded, low-lying depressions. In fact, if you're from the shore, you've probably heard the story before that these things were created when whales were stranded as the ocean receded, and that's where the whales wallowed around and created these depressions. Again, I'm sorry? Well, in some cases, I'm sure it was. Those, and again, the vernal pools, the temporary ponding, temporary pools that we have around here are really important for not only things like turtles and amphibians, but also things like dragonflies, other insects. And what's important, because they're temporary, there's no fish there. So the animals can rear their young without being fed on by the fish. So these are important regional ideas. Grassland birds. Mentioned grassland birds earlier. Interestingly enough, grassland bird populations are undergoing one of the fastest declines of all bird species. And it's habitat related. They require large blocks of grassland habitat. So let's look at an example. Say 50 years ago, a farm up the road here was a 100-acre patch of hay meadow. Okay, that 100-acre patch of hay meadow probably provided lots of grassland bird habitat. As the farmer got older, decided, I can't do this anymore. I think I'm going to subdivide this, the farm and sell off 10 1-acre lots. Well, that 100 acres of what was grassland habitat is now backyards being mowed and such. It's no longer grassland habitat. This is an important priority really across the country. Let's see, what else? There's about 15 species. Some of them, bobolink, meadowlark, different sparrows, are common grassland species.
Whippoorwills?
Whippoorwills would be another one, sure. Whippoorwills are right on the transition between grassland and kind of a brush habitat. So we actually have some places where whippoorwill habitat has increased because the grass farms aren't being managed and they're growing up in the brush. You go to Green Ridge area in Allegheny County. Whippoorwills are actually doing really well there. Yes, sir. That's $1 million question. The biggest, ringneck pheasant and bobwhite quail, of course, populations throughout the Northeast have declined or even crashed. The majority of it, we believe, is habitat related. And if you look at, some of the best pheasant habitat we had here in Maryland was Carroll, Frederick, fringes of Washington County. Look what happened to the habitat over the last 50 years. What was large contiguous farmlands now are housing tracts, plantation homes, things like that. So you've had a big habitat loss. Changes in farming practices are blamed as well. Farming 50 years ago is very different than it is now. We now have high speed, high capacity machinery. We started to notice about 10 years ago that the speed of the equipment when they go to mow a hayfield, for instance, has increased so rapidly that the hen pheasant didn't even have time to fly off the nest as they go through and mow. So there's just a lot of changes. Bobwhite quail, I'll throw in another one. Those factors contributed to them. What we're also seeing with them is the fact that, and I'll call it climate change, if you will, that we're getting more intense, say, dramatic storm events. And with quail, for instance, we had a study going on the Eastern Shore, had a private farm, about 4,000 acres in size, managed specifically for bobwhite quail, because the owner is very, very interested in trying to help restore them. We actually had radio collars on about 100 of those quail to monitor them as part of a research project. Well, the blizzard or snowstorm that we had about 2 years ago dumped 3 foot of snow in some areas. All but 3 of those quail died through that event. They were either crushed by the snow or they couldn't escape and predators got to them. So again, we're seeing a lot of dramatic changes to those types of species. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir. I just wanted to mention fescue is kind of a large part too.
Fescue, yeah, good point. Fescue in grassland settings, and especially in managed pastures, about 34 years ago, K31 fescue came on the market, and it was a really hot-selling thing, promoted amongst farmers because it grew really rapidly, could grow on about any slope, really tolerant, so it was a great livestock food. Over the years, research has shown that K31 fescue in particular develops something called an endophyte. Think of it almost like a fungus, if you will. And when certain animals eat that endophyte actually reduces their reproductive capacity. Cattle, cottontail rabbits especially, are some of those species. So I'm sorry, and it was ubiquitous. It was promoted, and farmers started planting that everywhere. It was used on strip mines, used along roadways because it was really good at stabilizing soils. It's really good at certain purposes, but it's not necessarily good for livestock or wildlife. So where we find that, we try to convert away from Kentucky K31 fescue.
You still sell it?
Do they call this an endocrine disruptor? Is that what it is?
That I couldn't say. I couldn't say if that's how it inhibits reproduction. I know that they do see decreases in litter size, if you will.
Okay.
So it could very well be an endocrine disruptor, yep.
Even if it didn't have that, it's so matted, it's like carpet, where they can dig for seed.
Right.
Is it just K31 or is it all fescue?
Well, no, it's primarily K31. And there is an endophyte-free variety that's now being produced that you can plant. We tend to get away from, especially K31 fescue, because as this gentleman said, it tends to, late in the growing season, tends to get real thick and dense, and almost to the point where animals don't feed upon it. So, but there are some other fescues. Red fescue is one that we do promote in our seeding mix. So again, talk to a professional, talk to a farm and garden store if you're thinking. Okay, there you go.
So they're taking it off the market?
K31, no, but what they've done, you can buy it, regular K31, or you can buy the endophyte free. Again, for certain purposes, K31 is a fabulous product. I deal a lot with reclaimed strip mines, and in some cases we'll get into some of these steep slopes that almost nothing will grow on it. K31 might be the ideal solution there, but of course we recommend the endophyte-free variety. Any other questions?
It's genetically engineered grasses.
I don't know that it wasn't developed at the time when genetic engineering in agricultural products was probably happening. I think it was just a variety that they found that really had good vigor and fit into the needs at that time. And you know, a lot of us that work in the natural resources or agricultural field, I mean, we're guilty of promoting some things maybe 30 years ago that we're finding now may not have been the best idea. Multiflora rose, as an example. 30, 40 years ago, you know, if you talk to for instance, a farm agent or something, they're going to say, yeah, you know, that area, that hillside, you're having trouble with erosion and stuff, plant that up multiflora rose. Now you won't have to worry about it. It provides great cover for pheasants and rabbits and songbirds. But what we learn later, you know, it tends to expand, take over unmanaged areas, and it's really hard to get rid of. But I will say it's still one of the best escape and winter covers for pheasants, rabbits, and songbirds. So the benefits it was sold on were great, but we didn't know, you know, some of the side effects that would happen. So that happens occasionally. Another regional priority, this is one that we're working on right now, is a bird called the American woodcock. And you may or may not be familiar with it. It's just a compact little bird with a long bill. It tends to be kind of obscure. You almost don't see them or hear them, but they're out there. We've been doing woodcock surveys for the last, say, 100 years, or last 50 years at least. And what researchers are seeing right now is about a 2% decline in woodcock populations every year. And that's attributed directly to changes in the habitat. Woodcock have real specific habitat needs. They feed primarily on earthworms and other invertebrates. They do that by putting their long bill down into the soft soil, probing around to find them. So you're only going to have woodcock habitat around wetlands, wet areas. And you also need some young forest habitat and opening associated with those wet areas because they actually roost in open fields. That's where they feel the safest. Okay. I got to speed up. That's where they feel the safest. So this is a real big priority. We're working with private landowners who have wet forests here in this part of the world, and on our public lands, we're doing a lot of woodcock management. Okay. Introduce another concept to you called carrying capacity. And carrying capacity is the number of animals a given habitat can support. It's something that's sometimes difficult to understand. You can't build up a surplus of animals on a given acre. It'll only support so many. So a lot of times we use this bathtub idea to talk about carrying capacity. Say that bathtub is a habitat. The spigot's running, and that spigot represents new animals being born or new animals moving into the area, into that habitat. Again, it will only hold so many. So some of those animals are going to have to come out, either through the drain, if you will, and how they come out of that population may be things like starvation, maybe killed by predators, die of old age, die of accidents, deer hit along the road. That habitat's only going to support so many. So if you've ever heard scenarios of, say, deer dying during a severe winter, that's because the number of deer on that particular habitat exceeded what the biological carrying capacity was at that time. So again, you can't surplus or store up, you know, extra animals. Mortality is going to take care of them. So the key things about a population, you have input primarily through births, you have decreases or outputs primarily through death or mortality. And it's a good thing that that happens because, as an example, if we take common robins we're all familiar with, single pair of robins may give birth to 6 young. So at the end of the year, we have 8 robins in that area. If we went 5 years without a single robin dying, down here we have 256 pairs of robins now breeding. Result is now we have 2,048 robins on that landscape. You know, if it weren't for mortality, we'd be up to our elbows in robins and other wildlife species. That's just how nature works. If we look at, compare, for instance, the number of animals on the landscape during the time of the year, this is a pretty typical population curve, especially for small animals, rabbits, birds, songbirds, chipmunks, things like that. Generally, they're going to start breeding in April, and that's about the time of their lowest population level. There's, you know, the ones that have survived and made it through the winter, there's only enough food available for a certain amount of those animals. Okay, they breed, their population increases to a point somewhere here midsummer when typically there's lots of available food. Think about cottontail rabbits. Middle of the summer, you're going to see a bunch of little baby bunnies running around your backyard and such. But guess what? Predators start working on them as the summer ends, food availability decreases. Mortality is going to bring that population back down to what we call biological carrying capacity. It's only going to carry so many of those animals. The only way to increase the biological carrying capacity of an area is to improve the habitat. So death is part of nature, sometimes sad, but it's just one of those functional roles. Okay, I mentioned limiting factors. Try to move quickly here. So when we talk about our habitat, our food, water, cover triangle arranged in space, we're looking to see which one of these things is the most limited, which one is causing the population of animals to be lower, and then we make improvements to that. Okay? Different animals have evolved over time to utilize different places in the forest, or canopy levels, if you will. Some are adapted to use this low-growing grassy area. Some animals, cottontail rabbits, for example, are adapted to live in this transition zone between, say, brush and grass and the older forest. Some, like the wild turkey or gray squirrel up here, are adapted to live in the older forest. So through evolution, over time, all these animals have evolved to live in different places. We call their functional role in these places niche, if you've ever heard that term. Okay, if you're going to try to manage, say, your back 40 for wildlife, okay, mowing it from fence row to fence row is probably not providing the best quality habitat for wildlife. You want some diversity. We say, think of it as being messy. You're letting lots of different varieties of plants and trees and shrubs and such grow, and that's okay. Okay? You're not trying to promote this park-like environment. You're trying to mimic basically a forest that's regenerating itself. Okay, edge, I mentioned that earlier. Edge is a transition of two different habitat types. So for instance, we go from this mowed, low-growing field and up to an adjacent large forest stand. That transition zone is called the edge. Okay? And in that case, that would be a very hard edge because it's an abrupt transition between the two different levels of habitat. A much better version is referred to as a soft edge. And you see the difference in the transition here. We go from kind of a meadow into a shrubby, scrubby area, into pole stage, into mature forest. It's a less abrupt transition, and that's actually better quality habitat. So if you're going to try to manage, you always want to consider that. Invasives, and again, we'll talk about some of the invasives here, but we have some plants and some animals that basically have found a new niche here in North America, and they're out competing some of our native stuff, and you have to stay on top of that. So control your invasive first, and then try to come in and fill in those spots that you created by controlling them with native plants. And it's going to be an ongoing project. Anyone who manages land is constantly going to be working on invasives. When you think about wildlife habitat, try to promote connectivity. And again, that's where using Google Earth to look at that landscape approach is really important. And we find, for instance, stream corridors, or in Maryland, you may have heard the term used, greenways. That's making connection between different habitats. That's why we promote those type of. Okay, you can, for instance, take an old field or your backyard and create habitat simply by going in, planting some trees and shrubs. And there's certain varieties that are more wildlife friendly. I've got a few of them up on here. There's all kinds of planting lists available through on our website, as well as through cooperative extension and such. So you can create habitat by planting the field or creating more of a soft edge by planting right up against a hard edge. And so you're actually going from a hard edge to a soft edge. Field borders, you can stop mowing those field borders and allow them to naturally grow in. Or again, you could go into, say, the woodland area adjacent to your field border, cut some of that, and by doing that, you're going to cause regeneration, and that's going to soften that edge as well. So there are different techniques to get to the same thing. So managing edge is important. As I said, you can go in, remove some of that edge corner, and you're going to get a softer transition. Okay, I got to move along. Mast is important. We always try to promote hard mast and soft mast. We don't want to, put all our eggs in that one basket and say we're only going to save the white oaks because we might have a white oak mast failure the next year. So we try to keep a diversity of different types of mast. Dead wood, whether it's a standing snag where woodpeckers create cavities, whether it's dead branches providing habitat for insects that certain songbirds may feed on, cavity large enough for a bear to den in, or, for instance, for salamanders, amphibians. If you don't have snags, you can create them by going in and girdling or chemically killing some of the trees. We try to promote at least 2 to 4 snags per acre anytime we're managing a forest. If you're going to do even if you're going to do a clear cut, you want to leave at least 2 to 4 snags per acre. Okay. All right. Brush piles. Yes, sir.
I keep running into tree people, people that take down trees that are all telling everybody you've got to get rid of every snag.
Mm-hmm.
To them, it's money.
Sure it is. Yep. And obviously you want to be careful if it's around your house. It may become a potential threat with a windstorm. But if it's out in the forest, we generally will say leave 4 to 6, because with snags and after you cut, you're going to lose a few of them in that process as well. You want to end up with at least 2 to 4 per acre in the end.
Snags are the standing.
Standing dead trees, yes. Brush piles are really important because they provide cover. Some animals use them as nesting sites and loafing. We loaf around. Think about animals, too. They need a place they can just go and chew out and not have to worry about a hawk coming down to grab them or a fox.
Like an old sofa or like an old
Yeah, there you go. Rule of thumb, if you're going to build brush piles, my rule is bigger is better. Start with a real firm foundation of logs or even pipe, and then smaller and smaller stuff on top. To me, a 6-foot high, 30-foot in diameter brush pile is not overkill. That's going to be sturdy enough that a coyote or another large predator is not going to be able to get to that animal that's using it. So, other habitat. I'm sorry.
6 foot by what?
6 foot high, 30 foot in diameter. Sure. Anything you do is better than nothing. Well, I'm dealing with tens of thousands of acres sometimes. Create dense thickets. Those are good areas for animals to escape from. They'll find food in it. What do you manage for? Again, we talked about, think about the things you're interested in. Think about the regional priorities. You're probably not going to want to attract more deer, because deer can have certainly a detrimental, and there's been all kinds of studies that show as you increase the density of deer, the number of songbird nests found in that area are going to decrease. You increase density of deer, the number of plant species is going to decrease. Just give me a cut if we got to go. Okay. So again, think at the landscape level. Let me try to get through a couple of our habitat management techniques. Work with your neighbors, that connectivity. Cats, this is a controversial topic, but there's been some recent studies that show that cats, especially house cats that you just let out at night, or actually kill more birds, mammals, reptiles, and amphibians than anyone ever did. They actually put live cameras on the necks of a bunch of house cats in Atlanta. They found that on average, your tame house cats kill about every 17 hours. They kill some type of native wildlife. So.
What about the feral cat?
Feral cats are even worse because they're out there all the time. Edge effect, if you have a lot of hard edge, there are some species that have adapted to utilize that. Brown-headed cowbird is one. See, this one egg is different in the nest. They've adapted this strategy where they'll come into another songbird's nest and just lay one egg and then leave and let that other songbird raise their young. As their young grow more rapidly than the others, they'll actually push them out of the nest until it's called nest parasitism. So you want to try to avoid that. Similarly, raccoons, you have a big raccoon population, they feed a lot on bird eggs. Jump through here. So forced succession, you guys have talked about that. Some habitat techniques, timber stand improvement. Jonathan touched on that a little bit. The idea is to get more light on the forest floor. It also opens up the canopy for the existing mass trees. They have better vigor. They're going to produce more food. Field border cuts. Again, if you have a field, you want to create more soft edge, you can cut along that border, and this is the type of regrowth you're going to get. If you've had a timber operation, they had an area called a log landing where they probably loaded the logs onto the truck. Go back, seed, fertilize, mulch that, and you can create little grassy openings, which are really important for instance, things like rough grouse, turkeys, because they'll bring their young out into these areas, call it brood cover, to feed upon insects. Full canopy removal may be called a clear cut. Some cases, that's the best prescription for that part of the forest. And there are some forest-dependent wildlife species that need blocks of young, dense growing forest, rough grouse being one of them. Field habitat, if you do have field habitats, we like to mow them no more than once every 3 years. You want to let that grass grow. You don't want to manage it like your lawn. You want seed heads developing and forbs coming in. But if you let it go beyond 3 years, you start to get woody encroachment. And that's where mowing or herbicide comes in.
Do you do the same strip? Are you mowing and keeping those same strips and letting them grow, or are you alternating the strips?
We prefer not to mow the whole area, unless it's a really small area.
If you have strip A and strip B, you know, every 3 years, do you mow the other strip, or do you leave that one strip?
Unless you have woody encroachment coming in, we'll alternate strips. You can do something else that's pretty cool if you're worried about mowing over animals, is start right here in the middle of your field and kind of mow outward, and that gives them a chance to escape, into the cover. Instead of mowing, starting at the edge and mow like most of us do, you're slowly reducing that cover for them to try to escape from. Den trees, snags, artificial habitat. If you don't have enough bluebird cavities, you can put up bluebird boxes, wood duck boxes, which this is. Wolf trees, these old, large, wide spreading branch trees. From a wildlife perspective, they're really good. From a forester's perspective, they're not so good because those big canopies are taking up a lot of growing space. So depending upon your objectives, you may want to save them or you may want to leave them. Lastly, any quick questions before we go outside? We're going to go out, and I'll certainly try to entertain any questions you have.
You cover the whole state?
I cover the western region, the 4 western counties currently. Yes, ma'am.
I wrote earlier that the grassland birds don't need as much edge, so how does that all...
Well, what that's saying is you don't want long, narrow strips of grasses. They're not as productive as a wide and large strip. Predators, and the biggest thing is predators for them. If you have a little narrow strip, predators don't have to cover as much territory to find their nests. Whereas if you have a great big kind of rectangular looking field, they have to spend a lot more time trying to locate where the birds are.
You want interior meadow habitat, just like you want interior forest habitat?
Yes. No, that's that's grassland.
Strip edge isn't going to work as well for the grassland.
No, not for grassland nesting birds. No, ma'am.
But if you do chunks, if you divide your field into thirds, you can do it that way.
Yeah, you want to have at least 10 acres minimum.
I'm trying.
I know. It's okay.
Yeah, so thank you, Jen. That's great.
You're welcome.
For a while still. So let's take a 10-minute break.